But at this point, I think we finally have enough puzzle pieces scattered across the 3 games to assemble a fairly accurate picture of this. The pieces that are there are never quite enough. My last FNAF lore theory and completed video game trilogy put the original FNAF tetralogy to rest. One final step back, one final mega theory, final timeline for the final game, final bits of the timeline.
There's a me,
It's over! It's done. Ending of the series, final FNAF theory. No 4th installment. No more FNAF 5 rumors, milkmaids at the tea till Freddy Fazbear. FNAF dead and buried once more. If this truly is the end, solving FNAF, the story of FNAF is at its end. It's final. No, today, we solve FNAF. Beep, boop, boop, beep, boop, boop. What? When did we jump from a point-and-click horror game to magical fantasy?
So true, bestie. FNAF has ended several times, but also completely refuses to end. This is actually an intentional narrative decision by Scott Cawthon to reflect William Afton's refusal to let go of the past, paralleling his journey as he tries to bring back those which he loves but unintentionally creates a calamity that all culminates into one grandiose ending that isn't received very well. Okay, so that isn't entirely true. I just did that for the epic League of Legends joke. But I think it's undeniable that the games refuse to die out about as often as their main villain, Thrice Burnt. Like a TV series that keeps getting renewed because it's doing so well, even though the writers ran out of ideas after Season 3. So today, let's take a look at every time the FNAF series tried to create an ending to the original story or beginning of a new one, and judge how well it could have worked. I'm gonna throw in a tier list ranking for each entry as well, but as you'll quickly realize, that ranking is a facade that, despite accurately reflecting how I feel, seems to reveal more about my deranged mind state that can somehow justify putting something in S tier, despite failing to come up with any concrete positive things to say about it.
3 is a magic number.
Ending at a trilogy. How classic. So classic that it's the only number of entries in a series that has a specific name. Quadrilogy isn't real. Tetralogy isn't real either. Pentology also. The best part of FNAF 3 as an ending is that it was before everything got all time-traveling ball pits and sea bonnies. Sorry. That was a very game theory joke. As far as we knew, FNAF was the story of a purple man who murdered kids and then those kids' souls possessed animatronics and got all spooky. FNAF 3 gave the perfect resolution to this. The souls were laid to rest and the killer was punished, except whoa, he's still out there. Which doesn't actually make this a worse ending in all honesty. It's just like a horror series, where no matter what, the killer might still be left out there, so the series could continue sometime in the indeterminate future, or simply fester in your nightmares. This was early on enough that there wasn't really a need to tie up every single loose end in a perfect bow. The story was a fairly simple horror plot with some hidden shenanigans. It hadn't been around long enough for us to feel like we needed everything answered. In fact, at first glance, it almost feels like nothing was answered. We didn't know what was up with the puppet, we didn't know who bit what back in '87, we didn't know anything about Golden Freddy. But here's the thing, I just tricked you. Like a buffoon. You're a buffoon. That's not true, sorry. These weren't actually issues with FNAF 3's resolution. This was early on enough that lingering mysteries felt like they could be solved. The puppet and Golden Freddy were certainly mysterious, but the different endings of FNAF 3 gave us enough closure to feel satisfied. Plus, for all we knew, they were just paranormal entities that represented parts of Christianity or something, like literally everything else in FNAF. We didn't even know that either of these two had kids' souls in them. And the bite of '87 didn't nearly have enough importance to people yet for it to be the unsolvable mystery that it is now. Most people thought it was Mangle and were satisfied with that, since, for the most part, the whole event was a bit of a throwaway line, simply said to make the pizzeria seem like a dark place with some potential cover-ups that has always been sketchy. But it gained so much importance to the fanbase that the culprit has likely changed several times to try to match the immense expectations that such a reveal would have. All this is to say that simplicity is FNAF 3's greatest asset here. It doesn't really feel like a conclusion to an epic saga because there was no epic saga to conclude. That's why it gets a B. It was a great ending for everything that had been released thus far, but it was a little basic because of that. Honestly, my opinion might be tainted by a rose-tinted Freddy mask, because the cut and dry beauty of this ending seems heavenly compared to the literal sludge that only experts are able to comb through now. Except in the gameplay. See, I think everybody at the time agreed that FNAF 3 was a good ending to the series, including Scott Cawthon himself, but only in story. A lot of people were quite dissatisfied with the actual gameplay of FNAF 3, including Scott Cawthon himself. That's why, instead of ending at 3, we got
Is a magic number.
FNAF 4, much more than 3, was really intended to be the end. Scott even put out a big fuzzy thank you image. It was all very final, and that finale was Dream Theory. Just the utterance of such a name sends shivers down the spine of every FNAF fan who was alive in, 2015. The general consensus seems to be that leaving FNAF 1 through 3 to be dreams in the head of a child in FNAF 4 would have been a bad ending. Or at least the general consensus is that's what the consensus should be. By all logic, it was just a dream shouldn't be a satisfactory ending, but as time goes on, more people seem to wish that Dream Theory was correct. Probably because the lore of the series is so fixated on having a recurring Saturday morning cartoon villain that it makes much more sense to explain this whole experience as the creation of a child's mind palace. Casting away all the wonky hogwash by simply evaporating it under the explanation that it was all just a dream leaves us with a cleaner solution than any other outcome could ever hope to achieve. I suppose if you don't know what Dream Theory is, you deserve an explanation at this point. But honestly, it's just what the label says. FNAF 4 recontextualized the events of FNAF 1, 2, and 3 to suggest that they were all dreams of the crying child. This was done by including several events, people, places, and things in the crying child's daily life that would serve as dream fodder for the little kid to get nightmares about. In truth, this video was originally going to be entirely about my thoughts on Dream Theory, but slowly I realized that a video on Dream Theory was actually a video about how Dream Theory is one of the best endings FNAF has ever had. It was the first, and still only time we've ever actually created a concrete conclusion out of this cacophony of vaguely connected plot details. Not only were we given solid evidence and clues, but this time, the solution seemed deliberate and intended. Admittedly, it's very hard to feel like any conclusion we come to was actually planned by Scott, when everything was so vague that only a high school English teacher could squeeze any meaning out of it. This makes Dream Theory a very compelling conclusion, though. The problem was that it was a real easy cop-out answer. Got plot points that don't make sense? Well, good thing it's a dream, so nothing has to make sense. I was never dissatisfied with this outcome, so it gets an A from me, but I could totally see people ranking it much lower. Though honestly, looking at any resolution this simple, in retrospect, would be satisfying. The main thing holding it back from an S is that it doesn't really wow me at all. It's an incredibly good resolution for what it is, but it's quite an easy one. Shocking only in the fact that most people avoid dream endings like a plague, so it's a rare sight to see. But it was just a dream doesn't answer every question. It still leaves some plot secrets present to prod at our minds with a Fazbear cattle prodder. For example, what's up with the puppet under Dream Theory? There's nothing in FNAF 4 to show that the crying child would imagine the puppet, and the Night Marionette was not canon while Nightmare Balloon Boy was. Real interesting things to analyze there, I'm sure. Maybe, possibly, kinda. But no one ever will, because now FNAF 4 just sort of exists in a quantum lore state that Schrödinger would be jealous of. A game left pointing all of its details towards a conclusion that has since been retconned away. So even though FNAF 4 was intended and fully committed to being the ending of the series, I hope it's clear now with the reasons I've discussed that people might not have been happy with that. So the show went on.
There she is!
Wow, 3 games in a row. I promise we won't talk about every single entry. Oh god, we're gonna talk about every single entry. Well, this is the first beginning we're talking about, and so the criteria of goodness is a little different. With endings, I figured it was pretty self-explanatory, just how good it would have felt for the series to end there. But beginnings are a little more obtuse, so exactly what we'll be looking at is how well did the game set up a foundation to be built off of, and a little bonus, is that sufficiently different from what came before? In both of these categories, Sister Location does extremely well. First, let's answer the more pressing question. Why in the family-friendly frick are you considering Sister Location a new beginning? And that's completely fair to ask. The game's quite different in tone, location, and gameplay, but story-wise it's just continuing the same Afton-based story that all the other ones have been following. The honest answer is that I'm constantly huffing a pizzaplex worth of copium trying to justify in my mind that Dream Theory might, in some way, still be canon. That would mean that FNAF 1 through 4 started and ended the story of the crying child, making the William Afton focus in Sister Location to be a new story. But a different way of looking at it, FNAF is an overarching story of the Afton family, made up of smaller sub-stories. The first 4 games were the crying child's tale. Or only the 4th was, and 1 through 3 are actually part of Michael Afton's, but that messes up the cleanliness of this diagram, so let's just uphold Dream Theory for now. Looking at it like this, it felt like Sister Location was the beginning of Elizabeth's story, with Circus Baby serving as the new villain going forward. But this is to view Sister Location without any of the foresight of the past, just as the Pilgrims did when the game first released. Obviously, we know now that Baby's reign of terror lasted about as long as Afton's children do, but looking at the game isolated from the future is how I choose to judge this one. I mean, I tried to judge them all like that, but I know I probably failed. So now that I've justified how this game could be the start of a new story, how well did it actually do that? Well, it succeeded in one of the most important aspects of a new story. It introduced its new villain extremely well. Lots of people really enjoyed Baby and her wacky antics. Most importantly, people wanted to see more of her, and that's crucial when setting up a story to continue. On top of that, the gameplay was fresh and proved wrong all the naysayers naysaying that FNAF was a little baby game for toddlers to play. And there's not a single day I spend rotting in an underground robot facility chilled to a warm 72 degrees without thinking about the fantastic tales of Vlad and Clara. Sister Location has some new faces, some old ones in news clothing, and some spooky sassafras. So obviously, it gets an A. That moment when Mike procced his Scion passive was pretty weird, and that kinda holds me back from being too excited about what might come after. Thankfully, we know what came after, and that was... the end. The big end. The massive end. And... to be honest, I don't have much to say here. We all know that this was an incredible ending to the story. It managed to tie up pretty much all the loose ends in the most fitting manner possible. A certificate of completion. And a loving homage to the yearly tradition of Nevada's Black Rock Desert. So I'm just putting it in S, but truthfully I couldn't think of much quirky commentary about why this is a good ending. I enjoy the ending as much as the next guy, so playing devil's advocate is unnecessary. The only input I could think of is that I don't even need to isolate this one from the future to fully appreciate it. I feel like a lot of people have been put off by Afton returning after this, understandably so, but still, I wouldn't say that Help Wanted and Security Breach bringing back Afton retroactively ruins this ending in any way. That just means that Help Wanted and Security Breach made a dumb decision. That shouldn't be held against Pizzeria Simulator. It's still an incredible ending to the series, and one I wish I could discuss more, but I've already forced it enough. So, how do you start a new chapter in the series from here? Hold your horses there, Buddy Buck Bumble. We can't just skip Ultimate Custom Night. I understand that suggesting Ultimate Custom Night as an ending is about as incoherent as a college thesis put together in the 5 minutes before it needed to be presented, but at the very least, it's the conclusion to William Afton's character, and that's as good as any other ending. We just won't dwell on it too much. Overall, it's fine. Again, judging this as an ending is a little incorrect. It's more like an encore. The story is simply that now William Afton is tormented by his own creations in hell for all eternity. It really just doubles down on this being the true final ending of William Afton's character, which is entirely sufficient as an addition off of the back of Pizzeria Simulator. But enough of that, let's go on to the actual next game.
Oh, no, don't do that. Oh, don't. Oh, that's horrible.
You don't. Sorry, that was the answer to earlier when I was like, so how do you start a new chapter in the series from here? Yeah, they chose to not start a new chapter because they instead brought back William and continued the story of the Afton family again. The fact that this slots into our earlier diagram so cleanly is an issue only because the overarching story here was already concluded. Twice over. But it'd be unfair to hold such a grudge against the game because most of that judgment I just cast is informed by what Security Breach built from Help Wanted's foundation. I'm not gonna judge Tesla's innovations in electricity just because a company bearing his name nowadays might not be so great. So, as we did before, let's isolate ourselves from the prophetic visions of the future that we get for being in an even further future, and instead focus on the merits of Help Wanted on its own. It's good. Maybe this is just me, but it felt like there was quite a bit of promise in where you could go from Help Wanted. Though my outlook also might be a bit tainted by the fact that I had my own amazingly flawed ideas of what Help Wanted was doing before I fully understood what it was actually doing. I thought that when the intro said that the original FNAF games were all literal games created by a literal indie dev, they were using that as a soft reboot, saying that the old games weren't real in this universe, but instead were based on real events in this universe, allowing the convenient brushing away of the more convoluted details and leaving a much simpler set of plot points to work with.
But that's not true at all. Fazbear Entertainment hired the game developer. It's an elaborate cover-up, a campaign to discredit everything.
Turns out I was wrong. Kinda. Almost everyone took this to mean that the events of the first 6 games were still real, but at the time, I still had a small amount of hope that this was simply doubling down on the whole based on real events thing, showing that some of the things from the games were still real, most likely the murders part. Obviously, we know now that everyone else was correct here and nothing was being rebooted at all. Well, nothing except for the fact that
Fazbear Entertainment is no longer a corporate entity.
So, in my quest to find increasingly arbitrary reasonings for my scores, I'll give Help Wanted an A, because I felt like it had a lot of potential in a foundation that it didn't actually build. Now, my conclusion isn't entirely based on my own headcanon of what I thought would be a better story, because I also believe that the story Help Wanted did go with is quite good as well. I mean, they brought back Afton as a wacky computer virus someone got from downloading the FNAF soundtrack on LimeWire, but that at least gives him a gimmick that sets him apart from his previous appearances. More importantly, though, they laid the groundwork for a new villain that people were excited about, which is the same justification for why I put Sister Location in A. An amazing setup with one strange decision. We'll just have to see what they do with this foundation. Ah, so that's what they did. I have a lot I could say about Security Breach, including another wacky idea on how I thought they'd do things before I fully understood everything, just like I had with Help Wanted. But a lot of that is gameplay oriented, so you're spared the tangent for now. When it comes to story, there's a lot of options to go for since there's a brand new antagonist to toy around with. But Security Breach is unique in this list as it's the first game that told a self-contained story. That is to say, it counts as both a beginning and an ending. Although it also functions as 2 endings, that isn't quite as unique because Pizzeria Simulator rodeoed a whopping 3 stories to end in its plot, but the second story that Security Breach ended is quite an interesting one. So let's take this one at a time. As a beginning to a new story, Security Breach gets a C. Now that rating might confuse you as we go on into my deeper thoughts on the matter, because you'll probably notice that I failed to come up with one good thing to say other than it didn't actually bother me too much. And having a battle of a cascade of reasons that something is bad versus I didn't mind it results in a completely neutral rating might seem a bit deranged, but ranking anything lower usually means that it did something really well but squandered it. A C ranking has no such something done well for me to be disappointed by when it isn't used properly. So I hope now you'll understand how my following thoughts resulted in such a lukewarm rating. With that out of the way, the main issue with Security Breach is that, like me, it completely fails at the one thing it's trying to do. It doesn't really begin anything. My galaxy cranium fails to see any way to push the story forward from here. This is mostly, and by mostly I mean entirely, due to the most enticing new aspect here, Vanny's story, failing, for the most part. For one, they ended her story already. Concluding a story in the same game that it started isn't inherently a problem. The problem is that the story barely even started. Clearly, the intention was to have Vanny's character be introduced, fleshed out, and then wrapped up over the course of the game, but ultimately she left less of an impact than the wet floor signs littered all over the mall. In part due to the fact that she only makes 2 significant appearances. In total, she appears 4 more times outside of those, but I only know that because I looked at the wiki. Her appearing in these different contexts can be so hard to realize that they feel more like Easter eggs than deliberate appearances of the main antagonist. It also doesn't help that her big twist was so obvious that it literally sounded like a joke.
Vanny.
It is very similar to Vanessa, and also Bunny.
So they fixed it by adding in the classic FNAF spice of muddied details that makes it so you can never quite be sure of anything in the lore. Besides Vanny, there's not much else you can really build on from here. There's no new plot that makes us want to come back. The only way forward is to start a brand new story again, which means that Security Breach didn't do too well at starting its own. But again, that's only because they built the end of the story into Security Breach as well. So it should only be a problem if the ending wasn't a good conclusion to our story. Security Breach also served as the fourth ending to Afton's story, so it got two chances to do this properly. And in both of these regards, Security Breach failed pretty hard. As I alluded to earlier, Vanny's story barely got to begin, so any ending you could possibly give it would feel as unsatisfying as trying to crunch a soft leaf. Now you might say, oh, but the Afton ending is the canonical one, and it doesn't resolve Vanny's story, so she can still come back. But the problem is, that would be even worse. It doesn't matter which ending is canon, because either way there's downsides. If it's the Afton ending, then Vanny's story is unresolved. If it's any other ending, then Afton isn't even addressed. Steel Wool have written themselves into a literary Iron Maiden where the best option to escape is to just scrap everything and start over again. If they bring Vanny back, it will be entirely unenticing because there's already multiple endings in Security Breach that give us some resolution to Vanny's story. And if they don't bring Vanny back, then we're left with the lost potential of a story that never truly began. I will say though, the Princess Quest ending was really nice, even if it felt a bit unearned. But there's also the Afton side of this coin. Ignoring the fact that he's back again, they took away his one unique trait. He was a virus, and that at least gave him a new twist where he can enact his evil schemes from a non-physical plane of existence and can't simply just be, oh I don't know, burned alive to prevent him from causing more problems. But now instead, by his hands, he is once again given flesh. And I will admit, having the animatronics turn evil because of a virus instead of spectral toddlers is a more unique way of using Afton. The issue is, like Vanny, they put him down faster than Old Yeller. He only exists in the one ending, where you kill him again. His inclusion would only be justified if they ended up doing anything with him. But they didn't. Even his secondary purpose of bringing in a new villain was pointless because, well, you know how that went. This is the first game beginning/ending where I actually dislike it to any capacity, just because it heavily squandered a promising foundation. Which means that, tragically, Security Breach gets a D. Yeah, that's pretty harsh stuff. Of course, this is once again viewing the game in isolation from what came after, but not by choice this time. Instead by poor planning on my part, choosing to do a video where I analyze a story as if it concluded when it's about to have a continuation. But even still, I don't think it's unreasonable to simply treat the incoming DLC bomb as a distinct entity here, and therefore something that should be judged separately from the rest of Security Breach. If the DLC manages to build an incredible story off of the back of what Security Breach has done, then that's something to praise the DLC for, not the decrepit pillar that the DLC had to reluctantly build its narrative off of. But I suppose that's all I have to... I guess that is technically a beginning to FNAF. The beginning. The big beginning. The massive beginning. And, to be honest, I don't have much to say here. We all know that this was an incredible beginning to the story. Okay, enough of that. Despite the fact that I was only intending to judge games as restarts that kicked off of an ending, I figured I might as well cover FNAF 1 because someone would mention it if I didn't. That's why I only covered it now, so much later that everyone who would have pointed it out already has. But this one is surprisingly simple. FNAF 1 gets an S. There's a reason it took off, and that reason is that it did really well at establishing a simple yet intriguing story. I mean, technically the only mystery in FNAF 1 was who the killer was, which ultimately didn't matter. You could easily say, like, Phone Guy was the killer, and be satisfied with that. But it was still a great start because there was a lot to build off of. The simple story of a murderer and a haunted pizzeria could easily be expanded. Even if you didn't need to, you could. And that's a really good way to make sure a game can be great as the start of a series or a standalone title. And, well, we can't just do all but one. F. This wasn't even a new beginning to FNAF, nor an ending. Terrible. Wait, special delivery isn't a mainline entry, right?